July 19, 1942. Akutan Island, Alaska. The fog rolled thick across the volcanic ridges of Akutan, a desolate crescent of rock and tundra in the Aleutian chain where the wind never stopped and the rain fell sideways. On this particular morning, a young ensign named William Thies trudged through knee-high grass, his boots sinking into the waterlogged earth. He wasn't searching for anything in particular, just another patrol sweep across an island that seemed to exist at the very edge of the world. Then he saw it. There, nestled in a depression of marsh grass, relatively intact and gleaming dully in the mist, sat a Mitsubishi A6 Zero fighter. The rising sun emblem on its fuselage was unmistakable. The propeller was bent, the landing gear collapsed, but the airframe, the precious, mysterious airframe, was whole. Thies stood there for a long moment, rain soaking through his jacket, staring at what every American pilot feared most, now lying silent and defeated in the Alaskan mud. For 3 years, the Zero had been a ghost, a legend whispered in ready rooms and briefing tents across the Pacific. It appeared without warning, maneuvered impossibly, and vanished before Allied pilots could get a clear look at how it worked. It had swept aside the British hurricanes over Malaya, obliterated the American fighters in the Philippines, and turned the skies above Pearl Harbor into a shooting gallery. Pilots who survived encounters with the Zero spoke of it with a kind of reverent dread. It could turn inside any Allied fighter, climb faster, and stay airborne longer. In the opening months of the Pacific War, the Zero achieved a kill ratio that seemed to defy the laws of engineering and aerodynamics. American aviators weren't just being outflown. They were being outmatched by a machine they couldn't understand. Intelligence officers in Washington and Pearl Harbor had been desperate to examine a Zero, to take one apart and discover its secrets, but none had survived intact. Crashed Zeros were burned, shattered, or deliberately destroyed by their pilots. The Japanese had standing orders: never let the enemy capture the plane. And until that foggy morning on Akutan, they never had. The story of how that Zero ended up on Akutan began a month earlier, on June 4, 1942, during the Battle of Midway. Flight Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga was a skilled young pilot, part of the carrier strike force launched from the Ryujo to attack Dutch Harbor as a diversion for the main assault on Midway. Koga's mission had gone smoothly at first. His flight strafed the harbor installations, set fuel tanks ablaze, and faced only scattered resistance. But on the return leg, American ground fire found his Zero. It wasn't a catastrophic hit, just a puncture in the fuel line or the oil cooler, something small, something survivable. Koga signaled his wingmen and began looking for an emergency landing site. He spotted Akutan Island below, its flat stretches of tundra seeming soft and forgiving from altitude. His wingmen watched as he lined up for what appeared to be a textbook forced landing. The Zero descended smoothly, gear up for a belly landing, everything by the book. Then the wheels touched the grass. What Koga couldn't see from the air was that the tundra wasn't solid ground. It was a boggy marsh, deceptively flat, but saturated with water. The Zero's landing gear caught and flipped the aircraft violently forward. The impact snapped Koga's neck instantly. His wingmen circled overhead waiting for movement, for a signal, for anything. When none came, they faced an agonizing choice. Protocol demanded they strafe the wreckage, ensure the Zero couldn't fall into enemy hands. But their friend might still be alive in that cockpit. They circled twice more. Then, low on fuel and with weather closing in, they turned back toward the carrier. The Zero sat undisturbed on Akutan for 5 weeks, hidden by fog, terrain, and sheer remoteness, while the Pacific War raged on. When Ensign Thies stumbled upon the wreck in July, the American military moved with a speed that bordered on frenzy. Within days, a salvage team from the Navy arrived by seaplane, disassembled the Zero with care bordering on reverence, and shipped it in crates to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego. By early August, the Zero was being reassembled in a hangar that had been cleared and placed under armed guard. Engineers and test pilots gathered around it like archaeologists examining an artifact from an advanced civilization. And in a sense, That's exactly what it was. The Zero represented everything American aviation doctrine said was impossible. American fighters were built heavy, armored, powerful, machines designed to absorb punishment and deliver overwhelming firepower. The Zero was the opposite. It was light, almost delicate, built from an aluminum alloy that shaved weight wherever possible. It had no armor plating protecting the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks. It was, by American standards, a death trap, and yet it dominated the skies. The test flights began in late September 1942 at North Island, piloted by Lieutenant Commander Eddie R. Sanders and a rotating team of the Navy's best aviators. What they discovered in those flights would fundamentally alter American fighter tactics and engineering for the rest of the war. The Zero was every bit as maneuverable as the legends claimed. At low speeds, below 200 knots, it could outturn anything the Americans had. Its roll rate was extraordinary, its climb rate at low altitude superior. But it had weaknesses, critical vulnerabilities that Japanese operational security had hidden from the Allies. Above 250 knots, the Zero's controls became heavy, almost immovable. Its ailerons stiffened dramatically, making high-speed rolls nearly impossible. The engine, a Nakajima Sakai radial optimized for efficiency and range, couldn't match the raw power of the Pratt & Whitney engines in American fighters. And that lack of armor, the design choice that made the Zero so light and nimble, meant it couldn't survive sustained combat. A few well-placed bullets could ignite the fuel tanks or disable critical systems. American test pilots began developing new tactics, techniques that would be distributed to every fighter squadron in the Pacific. Don't dogfight the Zero. Don't try to turn with it. Instead, use American advantages: speed, altitude, and diving power. The boom and zoom tactic became gospel. Dive from altitude, make a single high-speed firing pass, then climb back up before the Zero could react. Never slow down, never get drawn into a turning battle. The Grumman F6F Hellcat, still in development when the Zero was captured, was refined based on test data from the Akutan plane. Engineers strengthened the airframe for high-speed dives, improved aileron response at combat speeds, and maintained the heavy armor and firepower that American doctrine demanded. The Hellcat would go on to achieve an astonishing 19-to-1 kill ratio against Japanese aircraft, becoming the dominant naval fighter of the Pacific War. But the impact of the Akutan Zero went beyond engineering and tactics. It shattered a psychological barrier. For the first 18 months of the Pacific War, the Zero had been mythologized into something almost supernatural, a machine that represented Japanese technological and martial superiority. Propaganda from Tokyo reinforced this image, and early Allied losses seemed to confirm it. The capture and testing of the Zero revealed a different truth. It was an exceptional aircraft, brilliantly designed for specific tactical purposes, but it was not invincible. It was a product of engineering trade-offs, just like any other warplane, and those trade-offs could be exploited. The mystique evaporated in the stark fluorescent light of the San Diego hangar, replaced by data, numbers, performance curves, and tactical recommendations. The Zero was no longer a ghost. It was a known quantity, a problem that could be solved. What? American pilots and engineers saw in that Zero was more than just an enemy aircraft. It was a mirror, reflecting two fundamentally different philosophies of war and national identity. The Zero embodied the Japanese military ethos of spiritual fortitude over material strength, the belief that superior training, discipline, and fighting spirit could overcome any disadvantage. Its lack of armor wasn't a flaw in Japanese thinking. It was intentional, a design that demanded the pilot be willing to die, that valued offensive capability over survival. The plane expected its pilot to win through skill and sacrifice, not through protection. In contrast, every American fighter was built on a different assumption: that industrial might, technological innovation, and the intrinsic value of the individual pilot's life should drive design. American planes were heavier because they carried armor, self-sealing tanks, radios, and redundant systems, not because American engineers couldn't design lighter aircraft, but because American culture refused to send pilots into combat in machines that treated their lives as expendable. This philosophical divide extended far beyond aircraft design. When Japanese aviation engineers learned, months later, that the Americans had recovered and tested a Zero, details filtered back through intelligence channels and prisoner interrogations, the reaction was disbelief mixed with a kind of cultural incomprehension. How could the Americans reverse engineer tactics so quickly? How could they disseminate new training procedures to hundreds of pilots across thousands of miles within weeks? The answer lay in systems the Japanese military command structure struggled to replicate. Standardized training programs, rapid information sharing, technical publications distributed widely rather than hoarded by elite units, and an industrial base capable of producing improved aircraft designs in months rather than years. The Americans didn't just capture one Zero, they built an entire knowledge infrastructure around it, turning a single crashed airplane into an intelligence windfall that reshaped the entire aerial campaign. Tadayoshi, Koga's body, was recovered from the wreckage when the salvage team arrived. He was buried on Akutan Island with military honors by the American sailors, a gesture of respect between warriors that the circumstances of modern war increasingly made rare. His grave remained there for decades, marked by a simple wooden cross, until Japanese veterans located it in the 1970s and arranged for his remains to be returned to Japan. In Tokyo, Koga was honored as a war hero, but the deeper irony was never officially acknowledged. His death and the capture of his aircraft contributed more to the Allied victory in the Pacific than any single carrier battle or island invasion. The intelligence extracted from that one Zero saved countless American lives and shortened the war in ways that no bombing campaign could achieve. Throughout late 1942 and into 1943, the Akutan Zero was flown repeatedly, tested in mock combat against every American fighter type, filmed from every angle and documented with obsessive thoroughness. Gun sight footage from these tests was distributed to training facilities across the United States. New pilots arriving in the Pacific had already seen how a Zero moved, knew its performance envelope, understood where it was vulnerable. They faced an enemy they had been taught to defeat, not fear. The psychological impact of this preparation cannot be overstated. Combat is as much about confidence as capability, and American pilots entered battles with the Zero knowing they had advantages if they flew correctly. That certainty, built on data extracted from the Akutan Plain, transformed the air war. By mid-1943, the Zero's dominance was over. American pilots who had once avoided combat with Zeros now actively hunted them, employing the boom and zoom tactics refined in San Diego test flights. The Zero itself, the actual Akutan aircraft, was eventually retired from testing and stored. It survived the war, unlike the pilot who flew it, unlike most of the men who fought in the skies over the Pacific, unlike the Japanese aviation industry that built it. For decades, it sat in storage, a relic of a specific moment when engineering met intelligence and changed the course of history. Today it resides in museums, beautifully restored, a quiet testament to a battle that was won not in the air, but in the methodical, unglamorous work of measurement, analysis, and adaptation. Visitors photograph it, admire the elegant lines, the distinctive paint scheme, the rising sun emblem. Few understand that they're looking at one of the most consequential intelligence coups of World War II. There is a particular weight to objects that change history not through their intended purpose, but through their capture. The Enigma machines, the documents at Bletchley Park, the V-2 rocket components seized in Germany. These things altered the war because one side possessed knowledge, the other believed secure. The Akutan Zero belongs to this category. It was supposed to dominate the Pacific skies for years, maintaining Japanese air superiority until American industry could build enough planes to overwhelm through sheer numbers. Instead, it spent the war as an unwilling traitor, giving up its secrets to engineers who spoke a different language and pilots who flew under a different flag. The Japanese placed absolute faith in their pilots' discipline, that they would never allow a Zero to be captured intact. That faith was not misplaced. Koga tried to follow protocol, and his wingmen agonized over the decision to leave him. But war operates beyond the boundaries of protocol and discipline. It is chaos measured in misfires, bad weather, and marsh grass that looks solid from altitude. What haunts the story of the Akutan Zero is how close it came to never happening. If the American patrol had come a week later, the wreck might have been buried by a landslide or washed away by storm surge. If Koga's wingmen had made one more pass and strafed the aircraft, it would have burned. If the crash had occurred on any of 100 other Aleutian islands, it might never have been found. The entire outcome of the Pacific Air War balanced on a sequence of improbable chances. An oil line punctured, a forced landing on treacherous ground, fog that concealed the wreck, and an ensign who happened to be walking patrol in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. History pivots on such moments, but we rarely recognize them until years later, when the full consequences become clear. For the Japanese pilots still flying Zeros in 1943 and 1944, fighting became progressively more difficult and deadly. They found themselves facing opponents who knew exactly how fast to dive, what altitude to maintain, when to break off, and when to press an attack. The Americans fought with a precision that seemed almost prophetic, as if they could anticipate every Zero maneuver. In a sense, they could. They'd practiced against the real thing. Japanese aviators began to suspect, through bitter experience, that their most prized technology had been compromised. But even as the evidence mounted, even as the kill ratios reversed and the skies over the Pacific filled with American fighters, the full extent of the intelligence breach remained murky. The Akutan Zero was an open secret in Allied aviation circles, but to the Japanese high command, it was a nightmare scenario they couldn't confirm and couldn't prevent. Their response was to develop new aircraft: the Kawanishi N1KJ Shiden, the Mitsubishi J2M Raiden. But by then, American industrial capacity and now superior tactical knowledge had shifted the balance irreversibly. The Zero had been designed in the late 1930s to address a specific problem. Japan needed a carrier-based fighter with the range to escort bombers across vast Pacific distances, the maneuverability to dominate dogfights, and the performance to outclass anything the Chinese or colonial Western forces could field. For those requirements, the Zero was a masterpiece, perhaps the finest expression of pre-war fighter design philosophy. But the war changed, and the Zero couldn't. Its lack of armor became fatal as American pilots learned to exploit it. Its engine couldn't be upgraded significantly without a complete redesign. Its lightweight structure couldn't accommodate heavier armament or modern systems. The Zero became a relic of 1940s thinking trying to fight a 1944 war, and every one of its weaknesses had been catalogued, documented, and distributed to Allied pilots courtesy of the Akutan aircraft. There is a deeper symmetry here, a pattern that repeats throughout the Pacific War. The Japanese military entered the conflict with technological and tactical advantages in torpedoes, naval aviation, night fighting, jungle warfare that they assumed would remain decisive. They underestimated their opponent's ability to learn, adapt, and industrialize solutions. The Americans approached war as a problem to be solved through engineering, mass production, and information sharing. They didn't have better individual soldiers or inherently superior weapons at the start. What they had was a system capable of learning at scale, of turning battlefield failures into design improvements, of distributing lessons learned to thousands of units simultaneously. The Zero's capture exemplified this perfectly. One crashed airplane became a training aid, a tactical handbook, and a blueprint for countermeasures, all within months. Japan couldn't replicate this process because their military culture discouraged the kind of open information sharing and rapid adaptation that characterized the American war effort. As the war ground on and the Zero's vulnerabilities became common knowledge among Allied pilots, a strange thing happened. The aircraft that had once inspired terror became almost pitiable, a symbol of Japanese refusal to adapt to changing circumstances. By 1945, Zeros were being flown by barely trained pilots, often on one-way kamikaze missions. the final degradation of a machine that had once represented the cutting edge of aerial combat. The Akutan Zero, meanwhile, sat in its hangar, a carefully preserved reminder of a moment when knowledge proved more powerful than steel. It had been built to project Japanese air power across the Pacific, to strike fear into Allied forces, to maintain dominance through superior design. Instead, it became the instrument of its own obsolescence, a teacher forced to educate its enemies. Walk through any museum that houses World War II aircraft today, and you'll find Zeros displayed alongside Hellcats, Corsairs, and Mustangs. The signs explain their specifications, their service records, their historical significance. They rarely mention that much of the Allied tactical advantage derived from a single captured airplane and the extraordinary intelligence effort it enabled. The Akutan Zero's legacy isn't just in the battles it helped win, but in the principle it demonstrated. That information, properly utilized, can overcome almost any material advantage. The Japanese had the better fighter at the start of the war. The Americans had the better system for understanding and countering it. In the end, the system proved more decisive than the machine. On that foggy July morning in 1942, when Ensign Thies first saw the Zero lying in the Alaskan marsh, he couldn't have known he was looking at the physical embodiment of a turning point. He saw only an enemy airplane crashed and abandoned. But in that moment, fortune had shifted. The ghost was captured. The legend was about to be measured, tested, and exposed. And across the Pacific, in ready rooms and training facilities not yet built, thousands of American pilots who didn't yet know each other's names would learn to fight and win because of what lay in that tundra grass, silent and still, waiting to give up its secrets.